good to be in Italy. It's actually my heritage, where I come from, so the one place where people can pronounce my last name. Also, a great place. I named my book Bitcoin Pizza, as Jeff mentioned, so obviously we have a lot in common here. So today, I'm here to share with you stories of decentralization and blockchain. So to start with, I'll show you a picture of a map. And I bet you're thinking to yourselves, what does a map have to do with blockchain? So let me tell you a story. When I was 16, I studied abroad. I actually came here to Italy, and I spent some time in England. And at the time, we used calling cards and physical maps. There weren't really mobile phones, or at least they hadn't proliferated yet. And so fast forward just 10 years later, and I moved to San Francisco to start a company. And I didn't know my way around the town, but I do know how I got to my first meeting on the first day, having no idea where I had to go. I used Uber. I just entered the location, a car picked me up, and there I was. And so before we get really into this story, I want to do a little interactive exercise. So if the AV team can help me and put lights on in the house, that would be great. And so for anyone out there, if you're able to stand up and you've ever used your mobile phone to call a taxi or an Uber, will you please stand up? Let's use that caffeine. Okay, that's a good amount of you. And then if you've ever gotten food, stay standing. If you've ever done food delivery with your phone, please stand up. Now, please stand up if you've ever used Airbnb or booked a hotel on your mobile phone. Stay standing if you've used any of these things. And finally, if you've ever used Yelp or a review service, Google reviews on your phone. And finally, stand up if you've ever used a map on your phone for navigation. Now take a look around. That's most of you in this room. And you can sit down now. So back to the story. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of companies like this one here, MapQuest, were working on giving better directions, or so they thought. And what they really were doing was taking the concept of a map, this physical thing that we used, and digitizing it. So it's simply just putting it online and allowing you to get directions. Not very creative, though. So fast forward to 2005, where a little company called Google launched a product called Google Maps. And now what Google did was incredible. They weren't looking at maps or digital maps as maps at all. They were looking at it as data that they could open up and allow other third parties and developers and companies to build on top of. And you know what happened when they did that? We saw the rise of ride sharing in Uber. We saw food delivery in every app that's existed since then. We saw the rise of Airbnb and hotel booking, also reliant on that location data. We saw Yelp in location-based reviews. We even saw the rise of dating, which I strategically didn't ask you to stand out about, but in short, we saw an entire generation, the past decade of business models that wouldn't have existed without looking at a map differently. Now, what did Google do? Did they make a better map? Did they have better software than MapQuest? Not necessarily. So the question is, how do we get from this map to this app? And what they did that was incredible was that they had an evolution in thought. So they changed the way that they saw a map completely as open data. And that's what blockchain to me represents first and foremost, is an evolution in thought. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you today about how the ways that we as human beings and the way that we exchange or transact, both online and in person, are changing now. And this is what I call the operating system. And so just in short, high-level overview, what we'll talk about is first the operating system of the past, where our exchange was mostly localized, and move to where our operating system is today, which is globalized but still centralized. And then ultimately get to where we are going in the future and what's already started to happen today, which is decentralized. So first, what do I mean by operating system? Am I talking about computers? Well, sort of. So yes, we have operating systems in computing to connect and direct the system processes from hardware to software. We also have operating systems in nature, how nature decides biologically to route its resources. And finally, in the background that I come from, in the social sciences and anthropology, we of course have operating systems in society. So anything from governments and institutions, social norms, mores, religions, and myths, ultimately. So let's start with the past. Where did we come from? Localized. So this is a rock, obviously, and it's not just any rock, it's a very special rock. It's called a zebra rock. And I bet you're thinking, a zebra, what is she talking about? So just to define, it's a rock that has black and white stripes like the animal, a zebra. So when I was a kid growing up with my two brothers, we'd find these rocks that we named zebra rocks in our backyard. And we'd collect them, and we'd put them in these buckets, and we would use them actually as currency. So we would open, stores, and we'd sell each other toys, and then this expanded to everyone in the neighborhood. We had 30 kids that were using zebra rocks. So anytime we had a lemonade stand, we would pay in zebra rocks. Or anytime the ice cream truck came through our neighborhood, we'd find some kid who had dollars, currency, and we'd give them zebra rocks until we ultimately convinced the man to accept zebra rocks. We even established this whole exchange rate, so dollars to zebra rocks, and when it was acorn season, we'd collect acorns and have fights with them, and it was a whole thing. So if you're wondering where I got my interest for cryptocurrencies and blockchain, it probably started here collecting rocks. So once we had all of these rocks, we needed to do something with them. We couldn't keep storing them in buckets in our closets. So we created a bank. This is my brother Mike. We made him dress up like a banker. We gave him a certificate. It was all very official. And he was in charge of setting the exchange rates and keeping the rocks in what we called a vault, which was under his bed. Now, one day there was this crazy scandal, and we found out that Mike had been stealing some of the zebra rocks. And to make matters worse, he had a crush on this girl down the street, and he would be giving her a better exchange rate than the boys that he didn't like. So ultimately, he fled the neighborhood. This is the last known photo of him. So if we think about it, yes, this is a ridiculous childhood story, but as I was thinking through what was localized exchange like, there are actually a lot of similarities between what our operating system was in the past and the present even, and this story. So trust was based in local community. You knew the people that you were interacting with, whether that was transacting money or getting yarn from the local person who's selling yarn. So therefore, exchange and communication was completely localized as well. You saw face-to-face the person you were dealing with. And ultimately, there are problems with this operating system. It was extremely limited. It was more expensive. Ultimately, it was inefficient, and it was smaller in scale. So we as human beings, we evolved. We evolved our networks, and we went from village to connecting our villages to global village. And we saw the rise of communications technologies, the internet, mobile phones, transportation, the Industrial Revolution, which brings us to the operating system of the present, where communication has been digitized and globalized. We're sending messages around the world in an instant. And therefore, we've placed our trust in systems or institutions, so governments, banks, brands, and retailers. So ultimately, a lot has changed, but really not much has changed at all. So if we think back to the story of the zebra rocks, we've basically taken localized exchange, these rocks, and just kind of like thought it would work again, but when we're dealing on a global scale. And so that's created a whole new set of problems in the current operating system. So again, the main theory here is that the operating system is centralized. So anything from our finances to what we know, to what we buy, to what we eat, and what we learn is centralized. So there are numerous single points of failure here where trust is now put in one institution. And so that's led to another problem, which is that our present operating system is opaque. So when I buy a cup of coffee or that pizza, I trust that I know where the things are coming from and that it's safe to consume. Or when I put my data On an email client or a social media network, I trust that they're not using it nefariously. But that's not always the case. We just don't know. So finally, the operating system also is siloed. So the business models of this landscape are centered around companies selling and making money off of their data. So we're not really in a mindset of sharing it, which leads to totally needing to be reactive, it taking days or weeks to track down information in these incredibly complex networks, and ultimately needing to regulate this system. So in short, in the current operating system, we trust systems, sort of. Now, another story, let's go back to San Francisco when I first moved there. I was in the midst of starting a company. I found my apartment, dealt with that whole process completely online. It was a new building. It had one of these key card access, and which is very convenient for sure. So one day, I'm at home from work, and I hadn't unpacked anything. I had boxes everywhere, and I get a knock on the door. And it's a police officer. And he says, "Ma'am, are you missing anything?" And I'm like, I don't know. So I go through my boxes, and it turns out my passport and credit cards and jewelry had been stolen, and I had no idea. And granted, that was a pretty crazy process, but the craziest part of the story is that when I went to the leasing office and asked for the records to my apartment from this key card, because I worked in technology, I worked actually with these cards, I knew you could get the data, they said, "We can't give that to you." So I needed to get a warrant to get the records of access to my apartment to find out who might have robbed me. And so that was a moment for me where I finally realized a lot about the current operating system, that we lack access and knowledge and control. But ultimately, what has been the cornerstone of this operating system is that we're lacking in trust. So we're in a world today where we see things, and we'll talk later about climate change, greenwashing, and these marketing claims for brands. Do you believe what's really sustainable or organic? We see fake news. What started as just gossip or lies has now been completely globalized and institutionalized. And so I'm not here today to talk about what we're lacking. We're obviously in the exponential and abundance mindset, so that brings us to the operating system of the future, which is decentralized. So show of hands in the room, who knows what blockchain is? It's a good amount. I'm not going to go too much into the what of this technology. There are a lot of great resources out there about it, and I'm talking more about why it's important. But just as a short primer of what is a blockchain, well, it's a badass digital ledger. It's not really that sexy when you think about it, if you think of accounting technology, but it's a backbone for information. So anything that you put on this ledger is distributed and decentralized. It cannot be changed once it's on there. And you can program logic on top of it called smart contracts. And so, yes, in terms of what the technology is, it is basically just an accounting ledger of transactions. But when you think about the basis of human communication, like why as humans we were able to evolve, a lot of that comes from language. And the first example of written language was a ledger. So before the agrarian revolution, when we started farming, the first records were actually just, record keeping of when it was time to harvest the crops. So in that case, you can think of ledgers as being everywhere. My grocery list, when I meet someone and I size them up for the first time, that's basically a ledger in how we process things. So back to my love of pizza and back to these delivery apps. I don't know if many of you in the room have had this example where you order a pizza and it doesn't show up. So you call the place, Alice calls the place, and she says, "I never received my pizza." And Bob, who's the pizza shop owner, says, "Well, I talked to the delivery driver in the app, and it says that it had been delivered." And so she's like, "Well, it's not here." And he says, "Yes, it's showing in my system that it's been delivered." And so on and so on. She says, "No, but I didn't receive it." And he says, "Yes, you did." And the conversation's over. And they get to this ultimate moment of prove it. Or they're dealing with these online customer service chatbots. So the rhetorical question I ask here is Alice trying to take advantage of Bob, Or is Bob lying and his system's wrong? Or did the delivery driver take it and is eating the pizza in the parking lot? We don't know. And in the blockchain-enabled future, where we have ledgers that are keeping records of these transactions, we would have a record of where the pizza was at any moment in time. We'd have the records or reputations of all of the delivery drivers. We'd have the data of where the pepperoni came from, and that would all be shared. And so, of course, this is a very juvenile example, although it's one we've all probably experienced and certainly do love. We all want to get our pizza. But it does make you think that blockchains are the operating systems, so the backbone, the data backbone, for a future that has become increasingly decentralized as we move from centralized to decentralized. So the shift that we're talking about here, when we looked at all of the problems or challenges that we're facing in our current operating system, which is centralized, we move to a decentralized future, which becomes more connected and transparent, proactive and inclusive. So it becomes a completely self-enforcing and smarter and more efficient system, but also a safer and more inclusive system. So we have a lot of myths, and I'm not talking about myths about blockchain, but myths about how we see these basic institutions in our society. So let's look at how blockchain's changing the world today. Myth number one, this is what money looks like. A relic of the past, something comparable to gold or these zebra rocks. This is what money actually looks like. It's data. It's zeros and ones on a computer in a database. And so our world has shifted. We've become digital and global, but our systems are still wrapped up in the physicality of the past. So this is also what money looks like. These are crypto kitties. They are on the Ethereum blockchain. They have value, and you can use them to buy pizza. This also is a $10,000 dress, but it's not just a dress. It's a completely virtual dress that only has value in this world. But money is starting to take on these new forms. And so in the decentralized future, blockchain offers an operating system for the exchange of value. So of course we're aware of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum that are trustless. They don't require the central authority of a government or a bank. They're completely global. And you have access to them 24/7. And the exchange of them is instant with no fee. So myth number two, this is what work looks like. Well, I hope this isn't what work looks like for some of you. If it does, this is maybe more of a future that you can look forward to. So work, as we learned earlier yesterday, is becoming increasingly more decentralized and distributed. People are working all over the world, across borders, at home. And so blockchain offers an operating system for work. We see new payments and benefits models for the gig economy. We're seeing platforms similar to Upwork that are decentralized and tracking your skills and reputation. We're seeing the evolution of something like credentialing or a LinkedIn move again to more decentralized reporting systems. And we're seeing even the nature of what work is, or the concept of work and leisure itself, the lines getting blurred. So yes, even this is work. This is Ninja. He is a Fortnite gamer and makes millions of dollars streaming himself playing the game. And so the streaming economy, which also is leading to something called the tipping economy, is made up of fractional payments where you're maybe getting 1 cent per interaction that you make online, and this is powered by blockchain. So myth number three, this is what education looks like. You know, the standard college or university centralized institution that you place trust in this brand. And so this is what education actually looks like. I was just in Chile, and I was speaking to someone, and he had great English. And I said, "Where did you learn your English?" And he said, "Video games. The video games in English are much better than in Spanish." I said, "Wow, that's crazy." And so education's completely changing, and blockchain is offering the operating system for this. So again, we're seeing things like credentials or qualifications that otherwise would have been given through a curriculum or a university becoming decentralized, and we're bringing in numerous data sources, maybe the number of hours you played this video game, or the number of times you've spent in a certain country can prove a language proficiency. So myth number 4, this is what manufacturing looks like. Again, the standard factory floor. And of course we know manufacturing is becoming more and more automated. We talk a lot about that. But what we don't talk about is the next level, where manufacturing and the production of goods is becoming completely globalized and distributed and decentralized. So we're having micro factories. And we see this starting in aerospace. So GE is working using a blockchain and 3D printers to produce replacement airplane parts on demand. And that blockchain is being used to store the very valuable IP. We see this also in textiles, something traditionally done in a centralized manner. 3D knitters producing on demand at the point of retail. And ultimately, we're also seeing this in the automotive industry, where things like tariffs are coming from the US, causing a lot of problems. And so people are actually just building factories closer to where the demand is or the point of retail. Myth number 5, this is what agriculture looks like. So we have the standard kind of land, but this is actually where it's going. We're seeing new models of production, vertical farming, again, closer to where demand is. And so blockchain is offering a new operating system for agriculture, a new way to share this data in order to produce more food of higher quality. And so where we're seeing this start is obviously quality assurance. So IBM, one of our sponsors here, is known for the food trust platform on blockchain, which was tracking lettuce and preventing food recalls, being able to track to the source in 6 seconds, which used to took 7 days. So when we're talking about collapsing these data silos, this is a great example for food safety. And also certification. So I talked about this lack of trust in claims made to product, whether they're claims of origin or claims of certified organic. And so these claims or the audits that are conducted straight from the source are being registered on these blockchains. So ultimately, that makes you question, what do we think about land use? If farming is going into these warehouses and factories, we have all this abundance of land. And so in countries where there's an abundance of sunlight and now land, we're seeing the concept of land use or agriculture change from farming goods or farming food to maybe farming energy. And so myth number 6, this is what healthcare looks like, the hospital. Right? But this is actually what healthcare is starting to look like. People aging at home, getting well or getting better at home. And so the operating system for healthcare that's blockchain-based is a model where you can bring your medical records anywhere you go. A large percentage of people don't have primary care providers. And so they're taking their data with them. Myth number 7, this is what transportation looks like. So again, we have the standard public transportation systems, but really, this is what it's starting to look like. So autonomous vehicles. And projects that are, existing right now in the blockchain space are actually that the car itself has its own identity, it's got a wallet, and this is a car charging itself and paying for its own charging, separate from any human interaction. And finally, the last myth, this is what governance looks like. So we have the idea of everyone co-located in a room making decisions or failing to make decisions. And this is the reality of what it actually looks like. People with cell phones all over the world. And so we have systems now, most commonly blockchain-based voting, where we can have complete civilian participation. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could go on all day. I'm sure it wouldn't be that exciting for you, but it's impacting every industry in the same way that most of you in this room, when I asked you the question about the apps that you've used, stood up. So it's impacting industries in this way. It will be the backbone for everything. But it's still very young. So the Bitcoin white paper, which first popularized the concept of a blockchain or repopularized it, was written in 2009. So it's only a decade. And so I know some of you are thinking in this room, this is crazy. What is a world? Is she talking about a world without governments and banks and hospitals? Like, that's crazy. And that's also probably, for some of you, exciting. And for many of you, I could imagine it's a little scary, making you think, what does this mean about my job or my company or my industry? And the reality, it is changing. And I understand completely. So this is me. When I was 18, I started my career as a competitive skydiver. And this, obviously, when you jump out of a plane, you can see the fear on my eyes, so it's kind of similar to the fear you might feel with blockchain. But what do you do when you fall? Has anyone fallen over, tripped, or fallen out of a chair before? What do? You put your hand out, right? You want to brace for impact. So the thing is, if you're skydiving, that's the opposite of what you want to do. So here I am on my first jump, or my third jump, and I go to brace for impact. And I stick my arm out to grab the airplane, and I start tumbling like crazy, because that is not what you want to do. So it made me think, we have these conditioned responses, right? That my body had been trained to brace in one context on the ground, but when I'm in this context, that's the opposite of what you want to do. So I thought a lot about how to unlearn my conditioned response, and that's what we have to do. We've been conditioned to think that our world should be structured as centralized institutions, and that's how we do business, that's how we relate to each other. But again, that's the wrong response. And so what we need to do is learn to unlearn to land on our feet as individuals, organizations, and industries. So I'm going to leave you with 3 high-level takeaways from this talk to better prepare yourselves and your organizations for the operating system of the future. 1, recognize that blockchain is a paradigm shift. So it's this shift in mindset from centralized to decentralized. So much more and so much more important than just thinking of it as a technology. Which leads us to the second point, return to first principles instead of retrofitting. A lot of the work I've seen and done myself over the past 5 years in this space is just, we've got a business and let's put a blockchain on it. And that's why we saw ridiculous things like the Long Island iced tea company changing their name to the Long Island Blockchain Company. It makes no sense. So really, you need to return to first principles and think about really what this shift means from centralized to decentralized. And finally, adopt a mindset of abundance and not scarcity. So when Google first opened up their data to third parties and developers, plenty of people said, well, how will you make money on this business? And who has the last laugh now? And so the idea of opening up your systems, of collaborating instead of competing, of building these new models where some industries might exist and some might not, it is scary, but if you go into it with an abundance mindset and trust that we will create better systems, then it will be okay. And so the last picture, this is Henry Ford. It's a pretty cliche example, but I love it because if Henry asked people before he made the first automobile, the Model T, what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Now, in the 90s or early 2000s, if people said, what do you want with this map? They would have said a better map. They wouldn't have said, I want Uber. And that's where we are right now with blockchain. So we're at this unique moment in human history where we have the opportunity together to restore trust, to restore the trust we have with ourselves, the trust that we have with each other, the trust we have in the products we consume, and the trust in the environment. And we're only just beginning. Thank you.